Welcome to Reverend Mike. Come in, come in. We're here in that pastor's study again, taking a bit of downtime. Existentialist thought can be exhausting, trying to understand the world, and for some reason coming back here and spending a little bit of time looking through different topics and following them around is relaxing. It's relaxing to me. Pull up a chair if you like. Got the usual things, coffee, there's some water over there. Should be some soft drinks in the fridge. Just make yourself at home. Just kind of hanging out, enjoying some downtime. And the topic of late has been railroads and steam locomotives and so forth. And thought about, getting down to the fundamentals on all of this, trying to understand a little bit more about, what is a steam locomotive and how does it work and what are other kinds of locomotives, but particularly steam, because that takes us pretty far back. There's got an internet connection here, and I pulled up this Wikipedia entry on steam locomotives, and it starts out pretty well. It says a steam locomotive is a locomotive. Okay, there's a link to what a locomotive is, that provides the force to move itself and other vehicles by means of the expansion of steam. There's a wonderful book called The Railroad, What It Is, What It Does by John Armstrong. It goes back to the 1970s. I was looking, I thought I might have a second or third edition. It's actually a first edition. And I also picked up the fifth edition. And it's a book that really gets to the fundamentals of things. What is, for example, a railroad? And I'll just flip here past the introduction. He starts out with, a railroad is defined as a system of railroad track, including the land, stations, rolling stock, rail vehicles, in parentheses, and other related property. The railroad track consists of two steel rails that are held at a fixed distance apart on a roadbed. The rolling stock, parentheses, rail vehicles that are guided and supported by flanged steel wheels and connected into trains, parentheses, is propelled on the rails as a means of transportation. So it's a fundamental definition. It also leaves a lot of rooms for further definitions. It's a print book, but those could be hyperlinks pretty easily. So what is a steam locomotive? And I was looking into this. I think most of us know what locomotives are, steam locomotives. We've probably seen them. Maybe as kids, we've gone to museums and gotten to sit in the cab, or as adults, I've done that too, as an adult, except you stand in the cab. Just going to Wikipedia here, what do they say? Steam locomotive is a locomotive that provides the force to move itself and other vehicles by means of the expansion of steam. It is fueled by burning combustible material, usually coal, oil, or rarely wood. I think back in the day it was usually wood, wasn't it? In the early 1800s, when these things started coming online. To heat water in the locomotive's boiler to the point where it becomes gaseous and its volume increases 1,700 times. Functionally, it is a steam engine on wheels. And then there are already two source links from there. And I was looking through, I found, looks like just a so-called treasure trove of things. It's a website, the Pennsylvania Railroad Company, PRR Documents. So the website is prr.railfan.net/documents. Most of the PDFs are in Google Drive for quick viewing. They have PDFs, so it's a Railfan website, and it is loaded with scans of old and somewhat new documents. And just look through here, it's broken into sections. History, it starts out with picturesque Pennsylvania Railroad. It's a photo album of early PRR scenery and a few other things. Address of the Committee of Seven. It's a report for a committee pushing for the creation of the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1905. address of John Taylor, Esquire, to the stockholders of the Pennsylvania Railroad Company. That's from 1886. History of the Johnstown Flood. But scrolling down a bit, it's got a section for rolling stock, classification of cars, freight operations, and these go back to the 1800s, passenger operations, motive power. And motive power I thought might be interesting, just to dig a little bit more at, well, what is a locomotive? What's a steam locomotive? How do you classify them? And that's really one of the points I was making earlier. I think railroads have enduring interest for a lot of reasons, and one is they're just familiar enough where most people, in the United States anyway, most people have seen trains, but not necessarily up close. They might be off in the distance. Maybe they've never been on one, never taken an Amtrak somewhere. But you can see this thing in the distance. You can do the same thing for an airplane, and you might wonder, okay, I know what that is, but how does that work? How many cars are on this? Where's it going? Where is it? And asking, where's it going? Where did it come from? How many more miles to go? Starts to get into the romance of the thing. There's a lot tied up in history. Some of it good, some of it bad. And the history alone has so many different points of entry. You can talk about how these corporations were formed, how they were somewhat early examples of very large-scale operations, which were run before the age of computers, modern computers, electric computers. And you can get into things like the land grants policy of the United States, vast amounts of land that were given to railroads by the federal government. And that gets into, well, was it the federal government's land to give? The question, who was living here before? Who was living there at the time that the land was given over? So that's another tangent of history that can and has been explored. But then pulling just back to trains and things like that, you can dig into how do they work, how do they sound. There's a cool factor for a lot of people, and it's like so many multifaceted hobbies. Like, why are people interested in trains? I mean, if you go up to someone and say, I like trains, well, if you're younger, that can fly. If you're older, then you might get asked, or you may be thinking, well, but why do I like trains and railroads? What's fascinating? And I think there are lots of points of entry to it. So, as a bit of a tangent, but the Pennsylvania Railroad Company's website, a couple of the documents, I called up one, and let me see if I can zoom in a little bit. So it's Pennsylvania Railroad Company. So it's Pennsylvania Railroad Company, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington Railroad Company, Northern Central Railway Company, West Jersey, a seashore, West Jersey and Seashore Railroad Company. And this document, I'm not sure it says. I know it's from the early 1900s. Let me go back and see when this is. So this is from March 1st, 1904. Classification and description of locomotives. It's a circular defining the PRR's locomotive classification with tables of specification for each class. So as a practical matter, literally running the railroad, they wanted to take locomotives and classify them. If you're a hobbyist, okay, that's another point of entry. You get to slice and dice what these things are. If you have a model railroad, what's that on the track? Oh, it's a locomotive. Yeah, but what is it? Oh, it's a Baldwin 19 such and such. And the Pennsylvania Railroad Company did this. And this is a page. It looks old. Looks like it's from 1904, the scan here. And it has simple diagrams. There is a set of lines. Looks like more than half a dozen of them just on the first page. And then on the lines are circles. So the first one, it's one line, and then there are two circles above that. And the circles are spaced apart like wheels on a train. And next to that, it says Class A, locomotives with 2 pairs of drivers and no truck. And I think that the truck is that extension where there are wheels that I suppose they are there to further guide the train on the track, but they don't do anything. They're just spinning around. They have no motive power. They're not drivers. So that's the first one, Class A locomotives with 2 pairs of drivers and no truck. And the diagram is a line, and then you can see the 2 drive wheels spaced apart, but on that line. And then Class B, you see the line, and then there are 3 circles on that. Class B is locomotives with 3 pairs of drivers and no truck. That's Class B. And then Class C, locomotives with 4 pairs of drivers and no truck. And then it goes on. The first one is actually Class D that introduces a truck. So there are 2 big circles, and then in front of those are 2 smaller circles, and they're all on the line. So you can kind of imagine the locomotive plop down onto those circles. Class D is locomotives with 2 pairs of drivers, the big wheels, and 4-wheel truck. So you see the 2 big wheels, and then you're looking at it in profile, so just multiply by 2. Can't always do that with semis. Imagine, I think some of those have not just 2 wheels, but they might be doubled up, like 2 wheels on a side. So if you look at it, maybe you can't really tell in profile what it is. And it goes on down to Class H, locomotives with 4 pairs of drivers and 2-wheel truck. So it's all classified for however they would use that. And after that, it says, under these 8 general types, the different classes of locomotives are classified as follows. Class A1, subscript 1, I think it is, formerly Class Q, 44-inch drivers. And then Class A2, subscript 1, formerly Class Q, 50-inch drivers with tender. There are a lot of these. This goes on for a couple pages. And then there's another chart. Present classifications, old classifications, and this breaks it down even further. A number of pairs of driving wheels, diameter of driving wheels, size of driving axle journals, length of driving wheel, goes on down, size of cylinders, spread of cylinders, steam ports, exhaust ports, lap of valve, travel of valve, type of boiler. I'm not sure to what purpose this was put, but it's interesting reading. It's a bunch of columns, and with 40 to 45 rows on each page. It goes on, what page are we on? This goes on for 17 pages. The whole thing is 17 pages. Then there's another one from a slightly different date, but it's basically the same thing. Huh. So steam locomotive. That's an interesting feature. I think it's a tie-in for understanding the world, or anybody with expertise. Doesn't matter what you're into for school or work. or retirement, hobbies, anything like that. I think it's different levels of understanding things that come into play with something, with a question like, well, what's a railroad? What's a locomotive? I think we have the general understandings where, oh, a railroad, well, what goes into a railroad? There's a track, there's some kind of an engine on it, or a locomotive. Terminology might be different person to person. And it pulls cars, and what are some of the other essential features? Maybe it carries passengers, but what about a freight railroad? It gets into all kinds of things like that, and it's a really high level understanding, not necessarily superficial, but it's just a general understanding. If you say train to most people, I think they'll have probably somewhat different images, but a shared common experience of seeing them, of thinking they know what they are. And then if you drill down a little bit, maybe you work for a railroad and you have a somewhat deeper understanding, and you say, oh, well, it's not a steam locomotive. You're looking at a diesel, and diesel locomotives are really electric generators on wheels, where the diesel fuel isn't what's driving the train directly. It's really creating electricity, and the electricity is, you can get into all kinds of things. And the people at that first level, they still understand you if you're talking about a train. And then you can get right down to the nitty gritty. Maybe you're a maintenance technician on a steam locomotive. I saw this it was about 15 years ago, I think. I was fortunate enough to spend some time. It was a whole morning with a fireman on a historic railroad. I was there. I was working on a video project, and the railroad, and he had agreed. He was used to it. People would sometimes come in for school projects, news projects, things like that. He was very agreeable to being filmed, and I spent the morning watching him get a steam locomotive ready for the day's run. I saw there some of that wonderful expertise that you can only get if you're watching, say, a car mechanic or a fireman on a locomotive, or a hobbyist who's so into it that you don't even know how deep the rabbit hole goes. So steam locomotive at a high level, it has a certain look, it does certain things, it generates steam, it makes the wheels turn. And the fireman I watched getting the steam locomotive together, he went all around the locomotive. He had a fire built on the inside. He had an oil can, and he knew exactly where to top off the oil, all of the different points. As he was saying, he had sticks of grease. They were rectangular sticks. I think you could fit a few in your hand, and those went into certain places. He was watching the water gauge, and he was getting this whole thing ready. He was bringing it to life, and it was a really special experience, and I got a lot of good video out of it as well. That's why I was there, and he was a character too. He knew all about the locomotive. He had certain attitudes on life, so that was another aspect of it too. And I got to see up close. Just even there, it was only a sense of everything that went into it, because behind what he was doing, he knew exactly what to do. He had studied that. And he walked me through a little bit. He started naming parts, and he said that people who learn how to operate one of these and maintain them, they need to know what a blower is and what it does, and how the water gauges work, and everything on that locomotive had a purpose. And the paint was there to not just protect the metal, but also make it look good. So some of the purposes were a bit more cosmetic, but he was really working around that locomotive. He was treating the whole thing as one complicated machine. It was almost like he was becoming a part of it as he made the thing work. It's like the really early trains. Like right now, braking on a train is automatic. Whoever's running the train up front, the engineer, whoever that is, they can pull the right levers and so forth and make the brakes on all the cars do what they need to do. But in the 1800s, there were brakemen who would ride atop the trains, and as a train would go around a curve, say on a mountain pass, they would hop from car to car and they would physically hand turn those wheels. There used to be, and you can see them on like model rolling stock, these hand wheels. So they were part of the whole operation. They became part of the train, and you might even say, well, what's a train? Well, it's a locomotive and it's rolling stock and it's the crew that makes it all work. Because the crew was such an important part, then they had to manually make that thing work. They had to put sweat, blood, people lost fingers doing this, riding around on the tops of these rail cars. You can see, like in model railroads again, you can see the running boards at the very tops of the trains that were designed to be walked on by people. I found another book online, well out of print. This goes back to, I think, the 1800s, December 1898. And it's called The Evolution of the Steam Locomotive, parentheses, 1803 to 1898. And of course, after 1898, there were plenty more advances. By G.A. Secon, or Secon, editor of the Railway Magazine and Railway Yearbook, author of A History of the Great Western Railway, London, the Railway Publishing Company Limited. And the preface begins, in connection with the marvelous growth of our railway system, there is nothing of so paramount importance and interest as the evolution of the locomotive steam engine. At the present time, it is most important to place on record the actual facts, seeing that attempts have been made to disprove the correctness of the known and accepted details relative to several interesting, we might almost write historical locomotives. It's funny reading this from 1898, and he's talking about historical locomotives, the history of, let's say, less than 100 years. So chapter 1, he goes back to the beginning, more than 100 years, to Richard Trevithick, the Cornish mine captain and engineer, belongs the honor of producing the first locomotive. True, his original essay was a road locomotive. As long ago as 1796, he constructed a model locomotive which ran round a room, and on Christmas Eve 1801, he made the initial trip with his first steam locomotive through the streets of Cambourne. I think this showed up in a children's encyclopedia I had. He's got a diagram here. The first railway locomotive of which authentic particulars are known, and it's just a profile diagram. It shows, I think that's a smokestack, vertical smokestack. There's a very large drive wheel. I think it might be called a drive wheel. Very large wheel, and there's a rod connecting it to some different parts, and then there are the gears, and the gears of this large drive wheel are connected to another gear, and then there are two, maybe these would be called the drive wheels. They're actually touching the track. There are two of those. it is evident that some days prior to February 10, 1804, the engine successfully performed the journey, and that overhanging trees and rocks considerably impeded the traveling, several stoppages having to be made whilst these obstacles were removed. Mr. Humphrey, however, won the bet. I skipped right over the bet. So what was the bet? Well, let's see. There's something about teeth chattering. Here it is. As early as August 1802, R. Trevithick, according to his life as written by his son F. Trevithick, appears to have constructed a railway locomotive at Coalbrookdale. This engine had a boiler of cast iron 1.5 inches thick with an interior return wrought iron tube. The length of the boiler was 6 feet and the diameter 4 feet. The cylinder working this engine was 7 inches in diameter, the stroke being 3 feet. The next railway locomotive was that constructed for the Penny Darren tram road near Tivdill. Of this particular locomotive, and that's the figure I described earlier, it is possible to obtain authentic particulars, although much that is legendary already clusters around this historic locomotive. For instance, we read that the locomotive in question had a brick chimney, and that it was demolished by colliding with an overhanging branch of a tree. Then the amount of the bet between Mr. Humphrey, the owner of the tram road, and his friend, as to whether the locomotive would successfully perform a journey from Pennydarren to the navigation at Plymouth, is a variable quantity. The amount staked has been stated to be £500 a side and also £1,000 a side. And despite the obstacles and so forth, or I suppose because of the obstacles, Mr. Humphrey won the bet. And then another trip was made on February the 21st with 5 wagons, 10 tons of bar iron, 70 passengers. Weight of the engine with water and fuel was 5 tons. I'll give you a link here if you want to read more of this. Chapter 2 gets into further developments. We'll see how far he goes, all the way to 1898, I suppose. These are very old-looking steam engine diagrams. And now there's mention of prizes. There's a horse on one of these, a cycloped horse locomotive. More diagrams. So at what point do they really start looking like somewhat modern locomotives, the 1800s? So we're here all the way to 1840s. Trevithick's single locomotive, Cornwall, is now running on the L and NWR between Liverpool and Manchester. That kind of looks like a locomotive. You can see the coal tender behind it. I'm assuming that's coal. Could be wood. But it's got a really giant drive wheel, giant by modern standards. So it's not quite looking like a modern locomotive yet. Getting there. Figure 47 is Old Copper Knob, Furnace Railway, the oldest locomotive now at work, now being 1898. And it's almost a step backward. You can see the boiler pretty clearly. It's got a pretty tall stack. I think it's taller than maybe the classic trains have. It's got the 2 drive wheels, but they've got these weird, it's like they're mud flaps over them. So that's another development. More diagrams. We're about halfway through. More giant drive wheels. I wonder how much engineering went into that. It was just trial and error, and they were assuming a wider drive wheel was better. Could be. Here's some more. Here's one with, looks like 6 drive wheels. It's a Great Northern Railway engine fitted with one of Sturrock's patent steam tenders, figure 85A. Oh, that's looking like something. Yeah, let's skip ahead a bit, see where we are. More enormous drive wheels. They really look like toy trains. I don't mean that to be disparaging. To my eye, they look, I'll put it in quotes, they look a bit too big, too wide. The locomotives look a bit too squat, too short. To my eye, they look like they have awkward, really awkward proportions to them. I mean, here we are, figure 127, 7 foot 8 inch, single convertible engine, Great Western Railway. And it's just like a lot of the others. There are a couple of small wheels, but then there's a big one right in the middle. It's like a paddle wheel on a steamboat. And then there's a dome that's starting to look more familiar. The smokestack is shorter. Looks like an open cab. You can see a couple of people there. These are really good images to have. I think the person who wrote this book is living up to the promise pretty well of giving a history of this. And then moving on. We're already into the index. Maybe they're just British. They still look a bit off in terms of my conception of what locomotive looks like. Well, here's one. This looks like a model railroad locomotive. Figure 141, so we're almost at the end. 6 wheels, coupled bogie engine with outside cylinders, Highland Railway. I think the outside cylinders help. So it looks like it has 6 drive wheels and 1 4-wheel truck. And I'm getting that terminology from the Pennsylvania Railroad publication. This looks like a locomotive, or when I was a kid, I would have called it a train. I didn't know the definition of a train being a locomotive plus rolling stock. So this has a squarish open cab at the end, and it's riding almost above where the wheels are, and then there are 3 drive wheels, and they are of, looks like, identical diameter, so none of this paddle boat wheel stuff anymore. And then there are these 2 smaller wheels, and they're almost on, it could almost be a cow catcher. So now I realize they called that a truck, and those are right in front of the big drive wheels. And then there's this boiler, so it's round tube, and it's running almost the length of the whole thing. I mean, it's clear everything is built around the boiler. The proportions look good. I wonder how close to the golden ratio all this stuff is, and I wonder if that's why they look a bit better proportion. And then there are and it says in the description with outside cylinders, so now you can see all of these rods that are completely exposed, and you can see all of these linkages connecting the drive wheels. You can see, I think these are the cylinders. You can see this sort of round box just above the 4-wheel truck, and you can see some pipes and so forth. You can see some pipes that are built around the boiler. The whole thing just looks like a locomotive of that era. The others look British, maybe. It could be a British design philosophy that led to things like that. So that's figure 141. And let's see. Here we go. Here's more of a write-up. Figure 141 represents one of the Highland Railway's tin-wheel mainline engines with outside cylinders. The 6 coupled wheels So they've got the linkages visible. The 6 coupled wheels make this design to be well adapted for the heavy traffic of the system, whilst the leading bogie gives sufficient facility for easily negotiating the curves of the Highland Railway. The first newest class of express engines, designed by Mr. P. Drummond, is just delivered and is very similar to those designed for the Highland Railway by Mr. D. Jones, the late locomotive superintendent, except that the new class has inside cylinders, while those built 2 years ago had outside cylinders. The dimensions of number 1, Benny Glow, just delivered are cylinders 18.25 inches by 26 inches, the coupled wheels 6 feet, and the leading bogie wheels 3 feet 6 inch diameter. Heating surface 1,175 square feet, steam pressure 175 pounds per square inch in weight, in working order, engine 46 tons, tender 37.5 tons. Mr. H. Pollitt's design of locomotive for working the express traffic over the London extension of the Great Central Railway has 4 coupled wheels, 7 feet diameter, cylinders 18.5 inches by 26 inches, with piston valves, a bell pair firebox, and steam pressure 170 pounds per square inch. The tender holds 4,000 gallons of water and 5 tons of coal. Well, all right then. Let's see what else we've got here before we go. There's one other book. This is off of Project Gutenberg, so it's another out of copyright book. Tom Swift and His Electric Locomotive, or 2 Miles a Minute on the Rails by Victor Appleton. Contents: Chapter 1, A Tempting Offer. 2, Trouble Starts. 3, Tom Swift's Friends. Let's see. Chapter 1, A Tempting Offer. Quote, an electric locomotive that can make 2 miles a minute over a properly ballasted roadbed might not be an impossibility, said Mr. Barton Swift ruminatively. It is one of those things that are coming, as he flashed his son, Tom Swift, a knowing smile. It had been a topic of conversation between them before the visitor from the West had been seated before the library fire and had sampled one of the elder Swift's good cigars. Well, that's quite an opening. What year was this? I think this would never fly today. For at least the cigars would never fly. I can't tell, but Tom Swift. There's a whole Tom Swift series. Tom Swift and his motorcycle, Tom Swift and his motorboat, and his airship, submarine boat, airships. So that'd be 1930s, 19-teens. Let's do a little bit of research. Quick research. We have an internet connection. Tom Swift, fictional literary character, main character of 6 series of American juvenile science fiction. I'm just looking here. Back on Wikipedia again. It looks like Tom Swift and His Motorcycle was 1910, and that was the first Tom Swift book. Authorship. Now, I was wondering about this. So there's a character, Victor Appleton. Yeah, it's the house pseudonym. There's no Victor Appleton. The character was conceived by Edward Stratemeyer, founder of the Stratemeyer Syndicate, a book packaging business. This is one I was reading about a few years ago, book packaging. Back at this time, early 1900s, they would do this, and they did it with Hardy Boys, and then Nancy Drew came out later. Tom Swift, I think, was one of the first ones. So they would create this long series of books, and it's possible one person could write all that, but what they actually did was hire writers under a pseudonym. In this case, it was Victor Appleton. And they had different authors write the different books, and the whole business was packaging them. They had an assembly line style. Somebody would write, they would edit, they would do the typesetting, book cover, and it was all branded according to a Tom Swift story, that kind of thing. Tom Swift series ended in 1941. So let's see when this particular one was, his electric locomotive. So his airship, that was 1910. Motorcycle, motorboat, airship, sunken submarine boat, electric runabout, electric rifle, Tom Swift and his wizard camera, or thrilling adventures while taking moving pictures. Aren't these great? The titles of this day and age. Here we go. Tom Swift and his electric locomotive, or 2 miles a minute on the rails, 1922. That's awesome. I could go on. Let's save that for another time. Well, thanks for stopping by. I always enjoy the company, and I hope to see you again. Music is Frost Waltz, Kevin MacLeod, Incompetech.com. Licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0 license. http://creativecommons.org/licenses/by/4.0/. Until next time.